Imagine waking up to the sound of rain on a Saturday morning. Not the gentle patter that lulls you back to sleep, but something heavier. Insistent. You're in Galveston, Texas, and it's September 8th, 1900. The air in your bedroom feels thick, humid, almost liquid. You can taste salt on your lips even though you're blocks from the beach. You pull back the curtain. The sky is the color of old pewter, pressing down on the city like a lid. Palm fronds are already skating across the street outside, and you can hear the Gulf waters in the distance, a low rumble that feels wrong somehow, too loud, too close. But it's just a storm, you tell yourself. Galveston has weathered storms before. You dress for the day. Perhaps you're a clerk at one of the cotton warehouses on the Strand. Maybe you're a housewife preparing breakfast for your children, or a doctor making plans for morning rounds. The thermometer outside reads 78 degrees, but it feels warmer, the air clinging to your skin like wet cloth. By mid-morning, water is pooling in the streets. Not unusual for Galveston, the island sits barely 9 feet above sea level at its highest point. The bathhouses along the beach are already taking on water, waves crashing over their roofs. Children splash in the flooding streets laughing, making a game of it. Their parents watch from porches, some smiling, some with creases forming between their eyebrows. The barometric pressure is dropping. If you owned a barometer, you'd see the needle falling faster than it should. But most people in Galveston don't own barometers. They own dreams instead. Dreams of a city that calls itself the Wall Street of the South, a city that believes itself untouchable, protected by its own prosperity. The wind is picking up now. You can hear it testing the corners of buildings, whistling through telegraph wires. The sound isn't howling yet, but it's building towards something. The Gulf is advancing, block by block, street by street, erasing the boundary between land and sea. And still, most people believe this is just another storm. They have no way of knowing that in the next 12 hours they will witness the deadliest natural disaster in American history. That between 6,000 and 12,000 of them will die before Sunday morning comes. That Galveston, the jewel of Texas, is about to be erased and rewritten in a single night of water and wind. But right now, in this moment, you're just getting through Saturday. You're checking on neighbors, nailing shutters, moving furniture to higher floors. Doing the small practical things that make you feel in control. The Gulf is rising, the wind is strengthening, and the worst is still hours away. Before we step back into the sun-drenched streets of Galveston, if you believe these lost stories deserve to be remembered, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps us keep history alive. The paradox of normalcy. To understand what happened in Galveston on September 8, 1900, you first need to understand what Galveston was. Not just a city, but an idea. A promise. Galveston in 1900 was not some backwater coastal town. It was the largest city in Texas, home to nearly 38,000 people. It was wealthier per capita than Newport, Rhode Island. The Strand, its main commercial boulevard, was called the Wall Street of the Southwest, for good reason. Cotton flowed through its port by the millions of bales. Grand Victorian mansions lined Broadway, their turrets and wraparound porches speaking of old money and older confidence. The city had electric streetlights, telephones, an opera house that hosted Sarah Bernhardt. It had the first electric streetcars in Texas. This was a city that believed in its own permanence. The island itself was a narrow barrier strip, barely 2 miles wide and 27 miles long, sitting in the Gulf of Mexico just off the Texas coast. Its highest natural elevation was 8.7 feet above sea level. Most of the city sat considerably lower, but this geographical vulnerability seemed irrelevant to Galveston's boosters and businessmen. The island had survived storms before. It had flooded before. And it had always recovered, always grown stronger. In fact, many Galvestonians viewed their island's low profile as an advantage. The prevailing theory was that storms would simply wash over the flat terrain without finding purchase, without anything to tear apart. It was a comforting logic, the kind of reasoning that allows people to sleep soundly in hurricane season. On Friday, September 7th, the U.S. Weather Bureau's local manager, Isaac Klein, had noted disturbing signs. Klein was a respected meteorologist who had lived through Gulf storms before. He observed increasingly heavy swells coming from the southeast, waves that spoke of something massive churning out in the Gulf. He ordered storm warnings raised along the beach, but he issued no mandatory evacuation. Perhaps because there was nowhere to evacuate to, the bridges connecting Galveston to the mainland could barely handle normal traffic, let alone a panicked exodus of 38,000 souls. Moreover, there was a bureaucratic problem. The U.S. Weather Bureau in Washington had forbidden its local offices from using the word hurricane in their forecasts, believing it would cause unnecessary panic. The official terminology was tropical storm or severe local storm. It was a policy born from the confidence of an age that believed science had tamed nature, that modern meteorology could predict and control the weather's worst impulses. So when Galvestonians went to bed on Friday night, September 7th, they knew a storm was coming. But they'd weathered storms before. Their city was modern, progressive, wealthy. They had gas lights and telegraph lines and stock portfolios. They had ornate furniture shipped from New York and pianos imported from Germany. They had invested in Galveston's future because they believed that future was guaranteed. This is the paradox of normalcy. The very things that made Galveston great, its prosperity, its modernity, its success, created a kind of institutional blindness. The city was too important to be destroyed. It had too much money, too much infrastructure, too much momentum. Natural disasters happened to other places, lesser places, places without Galveston's advantages. Saturday morning, September 8th, began with rain and rising water. But it also began with breakfast routines, with plans for the day, with the assumption that by Sunday, this would just be another storm story to tell over coffee. The Gulf of Mexico was about to teach Galveston a lesson about the difference between confidence and hubris. The chronology of collapse. Morning, 8 a.m., 11 a.m. By 8 in the morning on Saturday, September 8th, the rain had become a grey curtain that erased the horizon. The Gulf was no longer content to stay on its side of the beach. Water pushed through the streets in sheets, not flowing so much as advancing, like an army with infinite patience. Isaac Klein, the Weather Bureau manager, left his office and rode his horse-drawn cart along the beach, warning people in the beach houses and bathhouses to move to higher ground. The waves were already crashing over the structures closest to the water. Families gathered their belongings, some hastily, others methodically, still believing they'd return by evening. The wind was steady now, perhaps 30 miles per hour, strong enough to make walking difficult but not yet dangerous. Palm trees bent in the gusts, shutters banged against houses despite being latched. The sound of the wind wasn't a howl yet. It was more like breathing, a rhythmic inhalation and exhalation that seemed to come from everywhere at once. In the wealthier sections of town, along Broadway and the avenues near the center of the island, families made decisions. Should they stay or go? The bridges to the mainland were still passable, but the water was rising. Some families loaded wagons and buggies and headed north. Others looked at their solid Victorian homes, their raised foundations, their hurricane shutters, and decided to wait it out. These were houses built to last, built by the finest architects money could buy. At St. Mary's Orphanage, on the beach west of the city proper, 93 children and 10 sisters of charity went about their morning routines. The sisters had moved the children upstairs as a precaution. They tied clotheslines around the children's waists, binding them together so no one would be swept away if the building flooded. It seemed like a sensible precaution. The orphanage was a solid structure, only a few years old. By 10 o'clock, the streets in the lower-lying areas of Galveston were rivers, not ankle-deep puddles, but moving water 3, 4, 5 feet deep. Horses struggled through the currents, carriages stalled. People waded through water up to their waists, heading toward the higher ground in the center of the island or toward the substantial buildings, churches, schools, warehouses, that promised safety. The barometric pressure continued to fall. If you'd had an accurate barometer and knew how to read it, you would have seen something unprecedented. Pressure dropping below 2850 inches and still falling. This was the signature of a massive hurricane. A storm with winds that no structure in Galveston was designed to withstand. But most people didn't have barometers. They had water rising in their homes and wind that was beginning to sound less like breathing and more like rage. Midday, 11 a.m., 2 p.m. By noon, the situation had transformed from concerning to critical. The water wasn't just high, it was still rising impossibly fast. Streets that had been passable at 11 were impassable by 11:30. The Gulf and the bay behind the island were merging, turning Galveston into a submerged sandbar with buildings on it. Families who had decided to stay in their homes now realized they had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to leave. The water outside was moving too fast, filled with debris, wooden planks, parts of roofs, entire trees, pieces of other houses. To step into that current was to die. So, they went upstairs. Thousands of families, in hundreds of houses across the island, climbed to their second floors. They gathered children, grabbed photographs, pulled up rugs, moved furniture. These were the small indignities of disaster. Having to choose what to save, having to abandon wedding china and family heirlooms to the water below. In some houses, the water kept rising. It came up the stairs, step by step, relentless. Families retreated to attics. They broke through roof shingles with axes and hammers, creating holes they could climb through if the water didn't stop. Parents held children on their laps, speaking in calm voices while terror coursed through their bodies. The sound of the wind outside was no longer recognizably wind. It was a sustained roar, like standing next to a waterfall, a sound so loud you had to shout to be heard. The wind was now measured at over 100 miles per hour, though the Weather Bureau's anemometer, the device that measures wind speed, would blow away at 2:30 p.m., registering 120 miles per hour before it disappeared. After that, there was no way to measure the wind scientifically. Survivors would later estimate gusts exceeding 150 miles per hour. At those speeds, wind becomes a weapon. It strips roofs from houses like pulling sheets off a bed. It picks up debris and turns it into projectiles. Boards, stones, pieces of metal, all flying through the air at lethal velocities. Windows exploded inward, not from pressure differences, but from objects punching through them. Walls vibrated, then shuddered, then in some cases simply gave up and collapsed. The water was now 15 feet above sea level in some parts of the city. On the eastern end of the island, entire blocks of houses were washing away, not flooding, washing away. Houses lifted off their foundations, floated for a few moments, then disintegrated in the current. The people inside had nowhere to go. Some managed to climb onto floating debris. Most did not. This is where the true horror of the Galveston hurricane began. Not in the wind speeds or the water depth, but in the realization that thousands of people experienced simultaneously that they were going to die, that their city was being erased, that there would be no rescue, no help, no miracle. Just water and wind and the structural failure of everything they'd trusted. Afternoon into evening, 2 p.m., 8 p.m. By mid-afternoon, Galveston had ceased to be a city. It was an archipelago of disintegrating buildings in a sea that had once been streets. The storm surge, the dome of water pushed ahead of the hurricane, had raised the Gulf to unprecedented heights. Combined with the rain and the waves, Water covered the entire island. Only the tallest buildings, the churches, the brick warehouses, the Victorian mansions built on raised foundations, remained above the surface. These became refugees. The Ursuline convent, built like a fortress, held over 1,000 people. The Tremont Hotel downtown sheltered hundreds more. Churches across the island filled beyond capacity with refugees who'd waded, swum, or floated to their doors. St. Patrick's Church, a solid brick structure, became home to nearly 1,000 souls packed into its sanctuary, water sloshing across the floor even inside. But for every building that held, dozens failed. The catastrophic collapse was most severe on the western and southern parts of the island, where the storm surge hit first and hardest. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Houses that had stood for decades were reduced to kindling in minutes. The debris from these destroyed homes became battering rams, smashing into buildings that were still standing, weakening their walls, breaking their windows, until they too collapsed and added their material to the churning mass of destruction. At St. Mary's Orphanage, the building that had seemed so solid that morning was fighting a losing battle. The sisters had tied the children together with clothesline, hoping to keep them safe. When the orphanage began to break apart around 3 in the afternoon, the children and sisters were still tied together. 3 boys somehow survived, found clinging to a tree the next day. The 90 children and 10 sisters did not. Their bodies would be found in the days after, still bound together by the rope that was meant to save them. In houses across the island, families huddled in attics and corners, water rising around them. Some managed to break through to their roofs. Others drowned in spaces that had been dry just hours before. The randomness of survival was its own horror. One house would stand while its neighbor disintegrated. One family would live while the family next door perished. Dr. Isaac Klein, the Weather Bureau manager, gathered his family, his pregnant wife Cora, their 3 daughters, and his brother Joseph, in their house near the beach. Klein had built what he thought was a sturdy home. By late afternoon, as the house began to shake on its foundation, he realized his error. The family retreated upstairs. Then the house collapsed. Klein, his brother, and his 3 daughters survived by clinging to debris. Cora Klein, his wife, died in the flood. Her body was never found. Isaac Klein, the man who had assured Galveston it could weather any storm, who had argued against the possibility of a catastrophic hurricane, spent the night of September 8th floating in the wreckage of his own home, holding his daughters above the water, having lost his wife to the very disaster he had failed to adequately warn against. As evening came, though in the darkness of the storm it was hard to tell day from night, the wind reached its peak. Survivors described it as something beyond sound, a physical pressure that made breathing difficult, that seemed to push through walls and doors. The rain wasn't falling. It was moving horizontally, each drop a tiny bullet. The water had reached its maximum height, somewhere between 15 and 20 feet above sea level across much of the island, and then, as mysteriously as it had risen, the water began to recede. Night. 8 p.m. Midnight. The eye of the hurricane passed west of Galveston around 8 in the evening, though few on the island could have distinguished this climatological fact from the general chaos. What they knew was that the wind gradually decreased from apocalyptic to merely destructive. The rain continued, but without the horizontal fury of the afternoon, and the water, that relentless water that had seemed determined to swallow the island entirely, began to drain away. But it didn't drain cleanly. As the surge pulled back toward the Gulf, it took with it the debris of a destroyed city. Houses, furniture, bodies, entire streets worth of material. This retreating water created new dangers. New currents that could sweep away anyone foolish enough to think the worst was over. People emerged from their refuges slowly, carefully. Those who had spent the storm in attics or on roofs climbed down into houses they no longer recognized. Walls were gone. Roofs were missing. Everything was coated in a thick layer of mud and debris. The smell was overpowering. Salt water, sewage, death. Outside, the landscape had been fundamentally rewritten. Streets that had been lined with houses were now empty lots. Landmarks had disappeared. The beach, the beautiful Gulf beach with its bathhouses and pavilions, was gone, replaced by a field of wreckage that extended for blocks inland. In some areas, debris was piled 20 feet high, compressed together by the force of water and wind into impenetrable walls of wood, metal, and worse. People called out names in the darkness. Mary, John, has anyone seen the Hendersons? The responses were few. The silence was worse than the storm had been, because the silence contained terrible knowledge. By midnight, the storm had passed entirely. The sky was clearing. Stars appeared, indifferent, eternal stars that had watched this catastrophe unfold and would still be burning long after everyone involved was dead and forgotten. The temperature was pleasant, probably in the low 70s. A light breeze was blowing from the north. Under different circumstances, it would have been a beautiful night. Instead, it was the night after the deadliest natural disaster in American history. An estimated 6,000 to 12,000 people were dead or dying. The exact number would never be known because so many bodies were never found, swept out to sea or buried under debris. Entire families were gone, no survivors, no bodies, nothing but empty lots where houses had stood that morning. Galveston, the jewel of Texas, the Wall Street of the Southwest, the city that believed itself invulnerable, had been nearly erased in less than 12 hours. And the survivors, those who had made it through by luck or providence or sheer stubborn will to live, now faced a new horror, figuring out what to do with all the dead. The anatomy of the failure. Why did this happen? That's the question that haunted survivors and that should haunt us still. Was it simply an act of God, an unavoidable natural catastrophe? Or was there human failure woven into the disaster? Decisions made, warnings ignored, arrogance that cost thousands of lives? The answer, like most historical truth, is complex. First, the meteorological reality. The Great Galveston Hurricane was a massive Category 4 storm, possibly borderline Category 5, with sustained winds likely exceeding 130 miles per hour and a storm surge that raised water levels by 15 to 20 feet. This was not a typical Gulf storm. This was one of the most powerful hurricanes to ever strike the United States. No city in 1900, built with the technology and understanding of that era, could have survived it intact. But could the death toll have been lower? Almost certainly yes. The failure began with the U.S. Weather Bureau's systematic underestimation of hurricane threats. The Bureau's leadership in Washington, particularly its chief Willis Moore, had forbidden local forecasters from using the word hurricane in official communications. This policy stemmed partly from turf wars with Cuban meteorologists who had been successfully tracking and predicting hurricanes for years. The U.S. Weather Bureau, in an act of national pride and bureaucratic territoriality, dismissed Cuban forecasts and insisted on making its own predictions. In early September 1900, Cuban forecasters were tracking what they believed was a major hurricane moving through the Caribbean toward the Gulf of Mexico. They tried to warn their American counterparts. The U.S. Weather Bureau ignored these warnings, insisting the storm would recurve and move up the Atlantic coast. This wasn't just a missed forecast, it was institutional arrogance overriding good data. Isaac Klein, the local Weather Bureau manager in Galveston, was in an impossible position. He could see the signs of an approaching major storm. The swells, the falling pressure, the increasing winds. But he operated within a system that discouraged alarming the public and that gave him no authority to order evacuations. On the morning of September 8th, Klein rode his cart along the beach, warning people to seek higher ground. But this was an informal effort, not an official evacuation order. Moreover, Klein himself had contributed to Galveston's complacency. In 1891, he had written an article dismissing the possibility of a destructive hurricane hitting Galveston. He argued that the physics of storm formation and the geography of the Texas coast made a catastrophic storm essentially impossible. This wasn't idle speculation. It was published analysis from the city's chief meteorologist, and it influenced public perception for years. When the storm began in earnest, there was no emergency management system as we understand it today. No coordinated response, no clear chain of command, no pre-positioned supplies or rescue equipment. Each family, each building, each neighborhood was on its own. The telegraphing system that connected Galveston to the mainland failed early in the storm, cutting the city off from outside communication. By afternoon, when the catastrophe was fully underway, no one beyond the island knew how bad things were. There was also the geographic trap. Galveston was a barrier island with limited connections to the mainland. The 3 railroad bridges that linked the island to Texas were rickety affairs, adequate for normal times, but utterly inadequate for evacuating tens of thousands of people. Even if Klein had ordered a full evacuation on Friday night, which he lacked the authority to do, the logistics would have been nightmare. Where would 38,000 people go? How would they get there? The roads and bridges would have become death traps, clogged with panicked refugees as the storm closed in. But perhaps the deepest failure was psychological. Galveston's belief in its own permanence. This wasn't unique to Galveston. It's a human tendency, this belief that prosperity and progress create safety. The city had survived storms before. It was wealthy, modern, connected to national commerce. These things felt like protection, like insurance against catastrophe. The Victorian era was the age of engineering triumphs. Skyscrapers, transcontinental railroads, steel bridges, electric power. There was a prevailing belief that human ingenuity could master nature, could build systems and structures that would endure. Galveston embodied this optimism. Its leaders truly believed the city was too important, too well built, too modern to be destroyed by something as primitive as a storm. This is the anatomy of the failure, not just missing a forecast or ignoring warnings, but a systemic inability to imagine disaster. The Weather Bureau's bureaucratic pride, Klein's published assurances, the city's lack of evacuation infrastructure, the absence of emergency response systems, all of these were symptoms of a deeper problem. Galveston couldn't imagine its own destruction, and so it didn't prepare for it. And when the storm came, when the water rose and the wind tore houses apart, and thousands of people drowned in their homes or were crushed in collapsing buildings, that failure of imagination had a body count. 6,000 to 12,000 dead. 1/6 to 1/3 of the entire population. The deadliest natural disaster in American history, before or since, a city nearly erased in a single afternoon. Could it have been prevented? No. Could it have been less deadly? Almost certainly. That's the tragedy that haunts the ruins. Not just that it happened, but that it didn't have to be quite so catastrophic, quite so complete. Some of those deaths were unavoidable. The storm was too powerful, the geography too vulnerable. But some of those deaths, how many we'll never know, resulted from warnings unheeded, systems that failed, and the very human tendency to believe that catastrophe happens to someone else, somewhere else, never here. Resilience and philosophical conclusion. Sunday, September 9th, 1900, dawned clear and bright. The kind of beautiful Gulf morning that tourists would pay money to experience. Blue skies, gentle breeze, temperature in the 70s. The kind of morning that made you glad to be alive, except that being alive in Galveston that morning meant being surrounded by death on a scale almost impossible to process. The survivors who emerged from their refuges faced a cityscape transformed into something biblical. Bodies were everywhere, caught in debris, floating in standing water, lying in streets, hanging from trees. Thousands of bodies, some intact, some horribly mutilated by their passage through the storm. Families searched for missing relatives, turning over boards, calling names, checking every corpse to see if it was someone they knew. The living faced immediate practical problems. Fresh water was contaminated, food supplies were destroyed or unreachable. Medical care was nearly non-existent. Doctors were dead or injured. Hospitals were flooded. Medicine was waterlogged. The smell of death was beginning to permeate everything as bodies decomposed in the September heat. The city's leaders, those who survived, organized quickly. The mayor, Walter C. Jones, established martial law and ordered all able-bodied men to help with relief efforts. The most urgent task was disposing of the dead. With thousands of bodies and no way to dig graves fast enough in the waterlogged soil, authorities made a terrible decision. They would burn the bodies. Men impressed into service, many of them at gunpoint under martial law, loaded corpses onto wagons and barges. They took them out to sea and tried to weight them down with debris, hoping the Gulf would take them. But the bodies came back. The tides, indifferent to human dignity, returned the dead to Galveston's beaches. This failed. Grotesque effort lasted only a day before authorities switched to the even more grim alternative. Funeral pyres. Across the island, great bonfires burned for weeks. Men dragged bodies from the rubble, stacked them like cordwood, doused them in alcohol or kerosene, and set them alight. The smoke from these pyres hung over Galveston for weeks, a constant reminder of the catastrophe. The psychological toll on the men forced to do this work, handling decomposing corpses of their neighbors, their friends, sometimes their own family members, was immense and unacknowledged. They did what needed doing because there was no alternative. But amid this horror, something else emerged: resilience. Galveston didn't die. Its people didn't abandon the island and start over somewhere safer. Instead, they began the work of rebuilding almost immediately, even as the funeral pyres still burned. Relief supplies arrived by boat within days. Food, medicine, tents, lumber. Houston and other Texas cities sent aid. The Red Cross, then a relatively new organization, mobilized its resources. Clara Barton herself, at age 78, arrived in Galveston to oversee relief operations. Money poured in from across the country and around the world, and Galveston survivors got to work. They cleared streets, salvaged what could be saved, and began planning not just to rebuild, but to build better. Within weeks, even as they were still recovering bodies from collapsed buildings, they were discussing an ambitious engineering project. They would raise the entire city. This wasn't metaphor. Over the following years, Galveston undertook one of the most audacious civil engineering projects of the era. They built a seawall, 17 feet high and 3 miles long, later extended to 10 miles. Then they raised the grade of the entire city. Building by building, block by block, they lifted structures on jacks and pumped sand underneath them, raising some areas by as much as 17 feet. Houses that had been at sea level were now perched on artificial hills. The project took years and cost millions, but when it was done, Galveston was genuinely safer. The seawall and grade raising worked. When the 1915 hurricane struck Galveston, a storm nearly as powerful as the 1900 storm, only 8 people died. The seawall held. The raised grade kept the city above the floodwaters. The lessons of 1900 had been learned, written in concrete and sand. But something else was lost in 1900 that could never be rebuilt. Galveston's confidence, its sense of inevitability, its belief in its own permanence. These died in the storm. The city was never again the Wall Street of the Southwest. Houston, located safely inland, gradually eclipsed Galveston as Texas's economic center. The shipping trade moved to Houston's new deep water port. The grand Victorian homes were rebuilt, but the families that filled them were chastened, cautious, aware of their own vulnerability in ways their predecessors had not been. What does the Great Galveston Hurricane teach us, 125 years later? Not just that hurricanes are dangerous, we knew that. Not just that coastal cities are vulnerable, that's obvious. The lesson is more subtle and more troubling. The lesson is this: prosperity is not protection. Modern infrastructure is not immunity. Confidence is not safety. All the things that made Galveston great in 1900, its wealth, its modern buildings, its electric streetlights and opera houses and cotton warehouses, none of these saved it when nature came calling. We live in an age of even greater technological confidence than 1900. We have satellites that track storms from space, computer models that predict their paths, emergency broadcast systems and evacuation protocols, and building codes designed to withstand hurricanes. We know so much more than Isaac Klein and his contemporaries knew. And yet, we keep building in vulnerable places. We keep assuming that our engineering will save us, that our wealth will insulate us, that catastrophe happens to other people in other times. We know that climate change is making hurricanes more intense, sea levels are rising, coastal flooding is worsening. We have all the data, all the warnings, all the scientific consensus we need, and still we build beach houses on barrier islands. Still we dismiss evacuation warnings. Still we believe, somehow, that we're different, that our city is special, that it won't happen here. Galveston in 1900 was the richest city in Texas. It had the best meteorologist available. It had solid buildings and confident leaders and every reason to believe in its own future. And in 12 hours, it lost 6,000 to 12,000 souls. The exact number will never be known, because no amount of prosperity or confidence can hold back the Gulf of Mexico when it decides to reclaim its territory. The lesson isn't that we shouldn't live in coastal cities, or that technology is useless, or that progress is an illusion. The lesson is simpler and harder. We are vulnerable, always. Our cities, our homes, our lives exist at the mercy of forces vastly more powerful than anything we can build or buy or believe in, and recognizing that vulnerability, respecting it, preparing for it, that's not pessimism, that's wisdom. Galveston rebuilt. It survived. It learned. The seawall stands as a monument to human resilience and adaptability, but the seawall also stands as an admission. We cannot stop nature. We can only prepare for it, respect it, and hope that when the next storm comes, we've done enough. On the beaches of Galveston today, tourists walk on sand that was dredged up from the Gulf and pumped onto the island to raise its grade. They admire the Victorian architecture, much of it lovingly restored after the 1900 storm. They swim in the same Gulf waters that killed thousands. Most of them have never heard of Isaac Klein or the Great Storm or the funeral pyres that burned for weeks, but the survivors knew. Those who lived through September 8, 1900, never forgot what they learned that day. That civilization is a thin veneer, that safety is an illusion, that everything we love can be erased in an afternoon by wind and water, and the sheer indifferent power of the natural world. That knowledge, uncomfortable, terrifying, essential, is the real inheritance of the Galveston Hurricane. Not just a death toll or a reconstruction project, but a lesson about human fragility that we keep having to relearn, generation after generation, disaster after disaster. The Gulf of Mexico is still there, it's still rising, and someday, despite our seawalls and our satellites and our confidence, it will come for another city, another generation of people who believe they're too modern, too prepared, too important to be swept away. When that day comes, We should remember Galveston. We should remember the families huddled in attics as the water rose. We should remember the children tied together with clothesline at St. Mary's Orphanage. We should remember Isaac Klein floating in the wreckage of his own home, having lost his wife to the disaster he failed to adequately warn against. And we should remember that being wealthy, being modern, being confident, none of it matters when the storm comes. What matters is respect, humility, preparation, and the clear-eyed recognition that no matter how grand our cities become, we remain small, vulnerable, and terribly mortal in the face of the natural world's power. Galveston learned that lesson in 1900. The rest of us are still learning it. For more documentaries on the fragile line between civilization and nature, subscribe to the channel. See you in the next storm.